Oh, and by the way, I just accidentally forgot. I just started recording the actual video, but the video will just be a little bit shorter, and I mean the audio will start where it usually does.
Okay.
All right, so uh, let me find it real quick. So society, like in the Western setting, it doesn't really promote this type of work, and like as a high school student, there's everyone around me is focused on like pretty much just pure hedonism and like trying to get as much dopamine as possible. And like even as you grow up though, like the setting around you doesn't really, it's not really conducive to consciousness practices in the West. So how do you like approach this and uh, grow within our Western society?
So for me, I think, in some senses it can hold you back, but in a sense it can act as a great mirror because what I find is that even though, I have been, on the path for quite some time, is that there are still things that are kind of conditioned into me that I perhaps take for granted because it's kind of like just the ground that I've always been standing on. And sometimes if I can see in other people a certain behavior that I also have in myself, it can help me sort of like shine a light on that and be like, okay, well, I can actually look at that and I can find if I have maybe particular urges to go toward that myself or any particular judgments maybe toward them I also have inwardly toward myself. So in a sense, I can use it quite a bit for like things like, shadow work and like actual like integration of various things. But in terms of like, actually realizing the true nature of the self, I find that it is quite difficult to live in such a fast-paced world that, expects so much, and especially at such a young age, probably even at your age, you're seeing a lot of people who are, fully immersed in work all the time and don't really have much spare time beyond that because a lot of people, are trying to get into college and things like that. And then, once you actually get into the work world, it even like accelerates more where you're just going to be like constantly going. And so it can be hard to find the time for stillness and to be able to focus on things that are beyond just, meeting needs and making sure all of the things get done. So
Yeah.
that's what I find personally most challenging. Then there's also sort of an isolating aspect to this work as well, because it's like if you have particular insights and particular experiences, it's not so uncommon to find somebody that you'd never find someone, but you could have an entire social circle where nobody really gets you and might just,
Yeah.
their eyes will gloss over, they'll look at you like you have a couple heads, like, or
Yeah, definitely. That's what you were thinking when you were talking about that. That was kind of what was popping into my mind. How can we like approach finding people that are also on this path? Because a lot of times we'll just, if we're going through the normal what everyone's supposed to go through, just high school, college, work, we kind of get, a lot of times we can just get stuck in comfort and we just have our same group of social peers, that social friends that are not on this path, and sometimes it can maybe be hard to shed those, not necessarily, maybe not shed them completely, but kind of to just grow into more friendships or getting to know more people that are on the same path.
absolutely, and I think it's really, really important to have other people who, like, if you tell them about these things, they're going to understand, and you get to have this aspect of yourself seen. Because, and I had mentioned this to you a little bit earlier before, but basically, if you're in a situation where you don't have any outlet for that aspect of yourself to get, appreciated and to be seen, then it can be very, very difficult to continue going on and it can feel very isolating. But if you have that and you can find other people to connect with, and the internet, I think, is also a great thing for this. But if you can find people like that, then it's almost like it takes the pressure off of your other relationships that you would have in life where you don't have that element that's shared. And you can find like other commonalities. And like, so my experience of having had my channel is that before, It was like I felt like I was really going to live and die with this aspect of myself not being able to be understood. And I felt this deep need to be able to share. And I just like I one situation that I was just thinking about the other day is I was working as a high school art teacher at the time, and like I was hoping to like maybe make a connection with one of the other teachers, and there was a guitar teacher there, and we were both in the same department, and I had this insight about like the different modes of reality, like the sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, and thought, as
Yeah.
almost like happening on completely different planes of existence. So like there being kind of a spurious connection there. So having that insight, it's like, oh, it's like, okay, so reality is kind of like the strings of a guitar, where if you pluck one, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the other strings, but if you pluck them all at the same time, it gives this illusion that they're all the same sound because they all come together as one. And so I was trying to communicate this insight to the guitar teacher because he was kind of, he was kind of chilled out. And I was like, okay, maybe, and he
Yeah.
was like, okay, and
Yeah.
it was always a connection there that wasn't there. But now it's like, given that I have that outlet, there's no problem because like I can just be the way that people are, to everybody else, and then whenever somebody gets it, I can have those kind of conversations and have that need fulfilled.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like with the internet nowadays, it makes it so much easier to just uh, talk about your ideas and everything, and even create a community around you that kind of agrees with you and everything. And when you're talking about not being able to like to connect, I feel what came up in my mind was like uh all these like masks that we put on ourselves, or like all these facades that we kind of wear. Like if you're contemplating into the nature of the self, then you kind of realize that there is no continuous self in every situation. Like in maybe one situation we're going to act a certain way because that's how we've been not trained, but that's how like how we've grown up, and that's what seems normal in that situation. And in a different situation, you're gonna wear a different mask, and you're gonna have a different self concept. Maybe even like your self concept changes in different situations. But like I feel like I don't know. I kind of lost my train of thought there, but it's basically like
It's kind of like the real self doesn't really get seen because you're so busy trading between masks.
you're just training between masks. And like I was gonna say how in certain situations, if you bring out like your true self or like talk about these topics, people won't. They'll think you're crazy because like it's a completely different aspect of uh like most people don't even think about that stuff at all, so they just see it as completely foreign. And so
Yeah.
like it's very important to find people that are on similar paths. But as you said as well, like the values and the benefits of Western society is that we get to hang around these people who maybe reflect the sides that we need to work on, or they reflect where we haven't grown. Because like if you're just in a group of people like that are focused on spirituality all the time, you could maybe miss that aspect of it where you're not seeing like all the opportunities for growth, and you just think that you already are, that you think that you have more experience than you actually do on this path. And yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And one thing that I found very, very helpful in this sense of like kind of in the same sense of mirroring as well, because like, you can have it in any kind of society where you can find a lot of mirrors to yourself. And so I think in relation to finding a kind of like, community like online or otherwise, is that you get to find a lot of like-minded people. And number one, the thing that it's helped me do is like, okay, number one, it dispels like kind of the almost special snowflake syndrome, because if you're the only person that's into something, it's kind of almost like it's like, oh yeah, I'm into a cool thing, and nobody else is
Yeah.
like hip to that beat. So that's one thing that it was helpful for. But then also being able to see other people sort of fall into various like spiritual traps, and then being able to see it from a third person perspective, it's a lot easier to then notice when you yourself are falling into that trap as well. And so that's been very helpful for me. It's like, okay, I see why that person got there. And I've had similar like mindsets as well. And so I'm just going to walk around that trap and, maybe fall
Yeah.
into another down the line.
Yeah. Like in all these situations, our ego kind of like take advantage of it. Like you talked about, you just feel like you're in this special group because no one around you is like doing like focusing on like conscious work or this kind of stuff. And like I found in the past, one of the biggest traps is like I remember growing up in like freshman or sophomore year in high school, and I was like, I had this big spiritual ego. Like I was like, I'm more developed on the spiritual path than all these other people, and that's like a very big trap. Like it's basically your ego getting into spirituality, and when the whole point is to paradoxically get rid of the ego, but there's so many ways that the self tries to hold on to its self concept and everything that's why I feel like this work is so challenging, because you have to be on such a high level of thinking and like figuring out how to avoid all these traps. Because like I you talked about like when you're in the spiritual community, you just see all these people and all the traps that they're falling into. And like one thing that I notice is like you can see people that are like 50, 60, or like they're very old and they're still falling into the same traps and not able to break through. So I think we can move on to like you said you had some sort of like contemplation practice since you were a kid, and you've always like contemplated like deep concepts. So at the start, was it just like you found it interesting to contemplate all these things, and then later on you kind of started to realize that you could take this really deep, but there's also a lot of traps that go with it?
Well, I suppose like it just kind of came about naturally, and before I maybe even had the idea of something being interesting or anything, but it was almost kind of just like, and I call this the seeking bone. Like some people just have that, like, and like have to like figure things out and like want to find out like mysteries and like to dig into things like that. And, even when I was like a small child, like, like when I was like 3 years old, I used to kind of like, sit in my room and I would remember I would just be thinking about a lot of things of like why everything is the way it is, as early as I can remember. And I remember when I was in elementary school, at some point, I would think like, okay, well, how is movement happening? Is it like, what if I'm like walking and then like every frame, like if I'm thinking about reality as being like a separate frame, every frame in between those frames, like a million years happens, but I'm not aware of it because like, what's happening is in the frame. Like, and I remember
Yeah.
thinking that when I was in elementary school. And I used to walk from my bathroom to my room, which was like right across the hall from my bathroom. And it was almost like, it's like, am I at my room yet? Am I at my room yet? Am I at the frame where I'm at my room yet? Where, and I was just like
Yeah.
looking like almost that pause. And the longer that I would ask myself, like, how long till I get to my room? And just thinking about the weirdness of there being a separation in time there. Like it always seemed like time kind of stretched out for me. Like, and realize, no,
Yeah.
I'm not there yet, but I will be there in just a minute. And so I would like go through a lot of these kind of thought processes. And it just like, without any intention to self improve, but just as like a curiosity and like just a natural like itch toward, contemplation in general.
Yeah. So
Oh,
a few.
and actually, hang on, I
Yeah. Go
remember
ahead. Yeah.
it's a different part of the question too. Yeah, so what got me more serious about it, and in a sense, this has been rife with its amount of traps too, because I kind of come at it not so much from a beginner's mind like I used to. It was that when I was 20, I had a couple of experiences of ego transcendence and realized that I had been lying to myself about quite a lot of things, and that I had essentially had an idea of how reality was, that it wasn't that way. And so afterward, it was kind of like almost floating around in the ether for a while, and eventually finding various different teachers to kind of almost help me like dig through to the other side of the rabbit hole that I'd fallen down, and from there, maybe
Yeah.
getting more serious about contemplation.
Yeah, definitely. That reminds me of like Eckhart Tolle and like his book. He talks about how he became enlightened because he was so depressed and that he just completely shed his ego because he was at such a low level. But then years later, he started understanding what that type of experience was. But what came up when you were talking was that uh so like on a certain level, society, not like society or like humans for like all of history, they've always wanted to like understand what is reality and everything. And I found that in my life too. Like I'm always at the back of my mind, I have these questions like, what's the point of life? Like we're just these human bags of skin floating on a rock. Like what's the meaning? And like, but at the same time, there's so many like outlets to like explore these different ideas. And then another thing that came up was you're talking about how as a child you're having all these like deep thoughts in like elementary school. And like in a sense, I feel like that's how a lot of times that's how it plays out. Like people when they're growing up, they don't have all of these like assumptions and beliefs thrown onto them by like their family or society or school, so that they just see things from a slightly different point of view. Like they're asking all these crazy questions about like even like existential questions. And in a sense, part of this work is like trying to get back to that place where we're trying to shed all of our assumptions and beliefs that we've taken for granted because our society told us that it was true, but we're realizing that maybe it's just an assumption.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that like as we learn things and grow older, it's like in a sense it helps us function in a more practical way, in reality, and we kind of like shed our naivete, and kind of like be able to, function in a way where things kind of work out, and that's hard to do. It's hard to grow up through that process. But also it's like there's a lot that's gained, but there's something that's often lost sight of. But it's that core innocence that we never really lose, but it just gets buried under a lot of stuff. So it's kind of like if you have like a table and the state of innocence is that table, then you pile a bunch of junk on top of it and like you don't know where the table is. You can't see the table because there's so much junk on it. And so, like, I think the main thing is to kind of empty your cup and to be able to kind of clear that table so that you can get back in touch with that sense of innocence and that beginner's mindset that children have quite very naturally. And I have a couple of kids myself, and my daughter, who is now 7, she I can tell that she has a bit of the seeking bone herself, and I think it makes her a little bit anxious, from time to time. But sometimes she'll come up with some really, really interesting insights that, like I'm surprised about, And so it's like I remember she had when she was maybe 4 or 5 or something asked like, oh, what happens, after we die? It's like, do we come back as somebody else? And then, I remember she was very little when this one happened. She had asked like, like she basically said something like the clouds are there to hold up the sky, which means that she was thinking about why clouds are there, and trying to find a reason for that. And so like, so she's always been trying to figure out how reality works and wondering how is all this here. And one thing that she has now is she'll say like, oh, and she's obsessed with like death, which is, which is kind of like one of those things. Like I'm like, Sapphire, stop talking about that. People are gonna think you're morbid. But she'll be like, if I died, nobody else would be able to see anything. And I think it's like her kind of thinking in a sense of like, her perspective is being like almost like the bubble that reality occurs within, and
Yeah.
kind of thinking in those ways as well. So it's interesting to see how it translates through to kids, when they start noticing little things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Like it's definitely one of the I've seen this over and over again in like the Zen practices, like the beginner's mind or no mind or emptying your cup. And it's crazy how like a lot of the work, like the majority of the work in this field is just shedding all of your preconceived notions, and like at the end maybe you'll realize enlightenment, or maybe you'll realize these deep truths, but in the meantime your entire focus is like, what do I think that I know that I don't, or like how do I balance between pragmatism and contemplation. And so that kind of brings up like the traps of all these fields, because like with consciousness work there's so many people like, oh, I just want to become enlightened, and or like how can I become enlightened the fastest, but it's kind of like this natural process. And like
Mhm.
I think some of the traps are like you just don't want to put in the work, or like you're stuck in comfort, or another trap is like, or yeah, that's basically one of the main ones. It's like you don't understand that you have to put in tons of work and that you know nothing right now, or like in like trying to chase quick fixes, but or like, yeah, I guess maybe some people don't have the right technique, but the kind of the main one is like not doing the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like a lot of people will have a tendency to put it off because like there's almost like this part of you that wants to fight against it. And I find that I have a bit of a resistance to staying still myself because I think there are perhaps things about myself that I don't quite want to face. And I think this also comes from ego not wanting to be undermined, because if you sit still long enough and you look at it long enough, there's a chance that that illusion can be seen through. And since we're so used to relating that collection of thoughts that, we would refer to as an ego or an identity, to what we are existentially speaking, and there's a conflation going on there. It's almost like undermining the ego itself, despite the fact that it's a collection of thoughts, would make us feel like we're undermining our own selves because we're so used to relating to them. And so what I notice is that, if I want to sit down to do, meditation and sit still, is like a lot of times it's like, oh no, I'm sleepy all of a sudden, or oh, I want to go do this thing over
Yeah.
here, have this going on. And, so I think part of it is like it's almost like the ego's way of like hiding out, and you kind of have to have the motivation to press past that, and, to
Yeah.
be able to discipline yourself and say, no, I'm gonna sit here. And then also what I find is like if I have particular things that maybe I don't want to face in myself, just on the more personal level, like a personal shadow of mine that, maybe there's a part of me that feels very wounded, that part will maybe be a bit sensitive, and like I'll basically cobble together some kind of reason why I shouldn't be facing that, or some kind of mental gymnastics to do this or that.
Yeah, definitely. Like in this work I found like in the spiritual community there's kind of this focus on ego, and it's like get rid of the ego or do these things to undermine the ego. But like in reality, like all these different cultures have called it like different things, like, but it's so uncomfortable because it's challenging who we are, and we spent our entire lives building up who we think we are based on all these concepts and everything. And it's like I feel like that's why we try to avoid it so much. That's why maybe in our society we're always focused on being stimulated and like being distracted, because we build up our entire self structure around like this illusory, like complex structure of thoughts that has no grounding. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it's like once I get into this work, it's like it's so paradoxical. Like it's so hard to grasp. Obviously, you can't grasp like what is enlightenment. You can only experience it, but it's still hard to grasp. How do I approach
Mhm.
this process so that I can grow and not get stuck in all these things? And yeah,
Yeah, for sure. And I think like one thing that I notice a difference, even though I don't presently live from the state of ego transcendence. I have experienced it a couple of times. And if I, relate back to those experiences, it was kind of one of the main things was a complete surrender to what is, so that like no need to fight against anything. And then also my thought process quieted down a bit, like in terms of like, because there was a realization that, oh, all of these things that I thought was emerald, these are just thoughts that I've been habitually thinking. They're not, they're not real. They're just like things
Yeah.
that habitually I'm always doing and in the habit of doing. And so because it's like that process kind of slowed down, it was like very easy for me to disidentify it. It just kind of fell away spontaneously. And at that point, anything on of the personal individual self that perhaps before I didn't want to notice, like maybe some shadows of mine or things that I had repressed away or decided wasn't acceptable or didn't suit my ego very well, all of that was like just very easily bubbling up to the surface of consciousness, like, oh, I remember having this here and I haven't had that trait since I was like in elementary school or middle school, and I decided this. And so it just, that aspect became really, really clear. But then beyond that, it was like almost like the personal self gave way to what was like, so like myself as being, so myself as existence and as an extension of that. So it's almost like everything was connected and everything was unconditional love. And I was capable of unconditional love only then and never before and never after, and feeling like whatever is 100% valid and nothing could ever invalidate it, including the individual that I've been used to call emerald. And so it's just, these were very profound experiences because it gave me this perspective of knowing what it's like to not have to carry around and focus all of my attention on carrying around that really heavy nothing that is that pile of thoughts called ego. And so it's
Yeah.
like you have to kind of contract your awareness to actually do that. It's kind of like if you're carrying like a really, really heavy thing that you can barely your attention at and just let it go. And you're like, oh, there's a whole world out here. Life isn't just carrying that thing around, and so it's really liberating.
Yeah. And what kind of came to mind was like, it's crazy to think about how every like personality, everyone who's unique and individual is only that way because of decisions that they made in their past that kind of built up this artificial self-structure in like the experience of enlightenment. Or it's just such a radical experience because it's like unconditional happiness, unconditional love, like most people have no like meter to like understand these types of experiences. So like
Absolutely.
that's kind of what in a way isolates you from a lot of people because they just, you can't talk to them about it and they just won't understand no matter how hard you try to explain it.
Oh gosh, I can relate to that so much because like this happened when I was in college and I was not spiritual like prior to these experiences at all. Like I had no interest in that. I had no knowledge of even what to call it. I couldn't Google it because I didn't know what it was. There was nothing that I could grab a hold of. And so I would try, with worse words than I have now. The words that I have now are a bit more accurate because I kind of have been able to orient myself to those experiences. But it was almost like maybe I would have described it at the time like I realized I'm the bad thing. I'm the bad thing and I need not to be me anymore. And you could try to explain that to somebody and they're like, okay, crazy
Yeah.
person. And it's like and so there was always that barrier there. And I'm sure for things got really thrown into disarray for me for about the first 6 months after my second experience, because it really overturned a lot of the structures that I would use to motivate myself that were actually motivated by some very negative kind of thought processes and low self-esteem. And so at that point, it was just kind of like I realized my work ethic that I had cherished so much, that I had used to be successful in school and had built up like a really high GPA. Like I'm like, oh, is that the enemy? Like all these things that I've been doing that I think are positive, are those things now the enemy? And so treating it that way and just doing really crazy things that people just did not understand, and like what is going on with Emerald, like, and so there was just this huge barrier to being understood. And it definitely, for me at that time, left some marks to just have no outlets whatsoever, or even a clue to be able to even look anything up on the internet as to what any of this is called.
Yeah, definitely. Like once you like start getting into this work, it's kind of like an ego battle where you're like, I found that I start getting into this work and then I'm like questioning all these things, and like everyone around me is just on the normal path that like I could have easily gone down that path and then I would just be like everyone else. But I chose to go down a slightly different path, which is kind of diverging into a massively different path over time. And like when you talked about like if you think like you just sound like so radical and everything, and like some people when they're on this normal path, like it sucks to say it, but like our society is kind of leads, there's a lot of people that are depressed because it's just the habits that we kind of promote are like lead to like depression, and like they're not very helpful on your self growth. So like psychedelics are obviously illegal, but like I feel like psychedelics aren't for the majority of the people because it could lead to a lot of like bad trips or like bad experiences because they have all these repressed or like depressing like thought processes. And
Absolutely, yeah.
like in like a lot of people, I feel like especially all the people that like see themselves as like creative people or like artists or something, a lot of them are just like, it seems to me like they're trying to like express themselves on like a deeper level, but they have a hard way to like articulate it, so they're just trying to find these means of expression. And that's like a lot of the deepest art is just like trying to express the human nature or behavior or whatever.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, when I was going through this whole thing with the ego transcendence experiences and acting crazy, it's helpful that I was an art student at the time in college, and so
Yeah.
I had a lot of open-minded professors, and so I used I used artistry as a front for the craziness that I was actually going through, and I was able to make a lot of like art pieces that I wouldn't typically make them, but it was almost like I had to go in those directions. And my idea before, I would always try to do a really good job. And so I was like, okay, I need to do these assignments. And so let's do the ugliest thing. Let's do something that I couldn't possibly ever be proud of, because that's the bad thing, right? Having self-esteem. This is the way I thought about it. It was a kind of a backwards way to think, but having high self-esteem is an enemy of good, and having accomplishments is the enemy of the good state that I was in, and I need to get back there again, and so I would just, I would do a lot of things at that point, to just try to fail without failing, like, and so in a
Yeah.
sense, able to still kind of get the grade. And I did make a lot of things I really appreciated at the time, especially for looking back on the memories of having made them and the process of it. But it's like, there was just a very different kind of way to look at it. But what I find a lot is that people with a more artistic side to them who want to express, it's often peppered with artist identity. And at that time, it was kind of good that I got to kind of wiggle out of that identity and realize that, oh, that's illusory, because it opened up my range of what I could, receive in terms of creative insights and in terms of what I could realize. And, just being able to think of art as more than just a vehicle for, exalting my self-concept to its highest, and just kind of appreciate it for the process.
Definitely. So I think we could like maybe move on to like, especially when a lot of people are like going through, they first learn about spirituality, they hear it from like a teacher or from like someone that has maybe more like enlightenment realizations and like insights. And a lot of where I think the problem is like they're these teachers are on like this deep level that like not very many people understand, and they're trying to convey to like these like people that are still kind of stuck in all these traps, or trying to convey to them how they can become enlightened. And they're like, oh, it's so easy, all you have to do is this. And it's like everyone has their own personal conflicts going on. It can be very hard to like maneuver around those to get realizations, or like, so I feel like a lot of the problem is that sometimes with gurus is sometimes people find a guru and the guru is so convincing because they're like, if you just follow what I say, then you'll become enlightened. Or if you just do this one process, then
Mhm.
you can reach realization and enlightenment, or whatever practice you're specifically going for. And so I don't know, what are your thoughts on like a guru? Because like some people it might be helpful for them and they like might find the right one, but for a lot of people it's like they need to like tread their own path and like do massive amounts of uncomfortable work discovering who they really are and their actions and stuff.
Absolutely. I've never personally worked one-on-one with a guru or anything like that, but I know that it's been helpful for me to listen to various different spiritual teachers and gurus, like just like on YouTube or read about things in the past. I don't do it quite as much anymore, but it was helpful for me to be able to kind of crystallize things in a sense, like to be able to understand what happened to me before, and then like to be able to know like where to go from there. And so there's a degree to which it's helpful, but then I think, on that level of just like listening to their truths that they're sharing, it can also reach a point of diminishing returns, because the idea is to get back in touch with that state of innocence. But, it's kind of like if you're continuously learning new things instead of unlearning things, it can go in the opposite direction. And so it's always important to tread very lightly with anything that's spoken in words, because it can very easily be grabbed onto with the intellect, and then, you know, backfiring, and it's more contracted perspective than you were before. And I think, like the best gurus and teachers try to mitigate that effect and try to make it clear to people, but there's only like so far that things can be expressed, without direct experience. And so I guess it just depends on the teacher or guru. I think, a more responsible teacher or guru would really emphasize the lack of importance of everything, including them as their form. Because I noticed that there are some gurus and spiritual teachers out there that'll, kind of be like, oh, I have all the answers, follow me. And since there's already a tendency for quite a few people to get into spirituality because they're just looking for answers and they feel maybe very desperate. It's almost like this powerful person preying on the weak to either prop up their own ego, or maybe for some financial reason, or, for various other abuses in power. So that's always something that has to be watched out for. But I would say that, when it comes to gurus, there was something else I was going to say, because there was a more specific question that you had asked, not quite remembering what it was. Anyway, like when it comes to gurus, it's important to tread lightly and always kind of hold all of their teaching like at arm's length. So in terms of not making it so much a belief, but more so like, hey, what they're saying maybe points the way to what I need to be focused on. Or, maybe this is something that's like kind of a vantage point to stand on for a few moments and look around and see what insights brandish themselves.
Yeah, definitely. That's kind of what I was thinking too, is like, especially with the internet, there's so many like gurus posting videos or like having this influence online, and like some people can go to the point of no return where they're just following everything and just like develop their egos, kind of like developing beliefs about non-duality or enlightenment. But like, but at like a foundational level, I feel like they all have practical value they can add, and like we can gain value from all these gurus, but it's just we need to have that skill set of like being able to tread lightly and to like not form beliefs around these ideas, and rather just trying to look to what they're pointing to and everything. And I know we talked about this a little earlier, but like in my own life, I was contemplating all these deep existential problems, and I came across the Leo Guru. I started watching all his videos, and I feel like it depends how you view these teachers and if you can gain value from them or not. Because like at the beginning, I was gaining tons of value from him. I was like watching all his videos, starting practices and meditation practices, and then without forming too many more practices, I just kept on watching more and more videos and forming beliefs and everything. And I got to the point where I'm like, he's distorting my beliefs to such a point that I'm not able to fully consider all these other ideas. And so like I think you would agree with me on this, in that all these gurus, or these not even like necessarily like enlightened gurus, but all these teachers online claiming that they have all like the truth and the answers, that they're good and bad at the same time, because if you use them the right way, they can help you grow, but at the same time, if you use them the wrong way, they can just diminish your growth.
Absolutely. No, that's a great way to put it. Yeah. So it really does have to do with the application of how you apply the things, because ultimately what you're trying to get down to is to cultivate, like, and this is just one facet, but like in terms of like the things that you learn there, it's meant to cultivate a space in the mind so that you can be open to new possibilities, and also to realize that the mind itself is inadequate to realize things about reality on the existential level. And so, in a sense, hang on, sorry. In a sense, doing all of the existential like questioning and listening to all these various teachers talk about various truths, you can realize, oh, I know all of these truths, but I don't really know them. These are all just like, possibilities and observations that have happened in the past by maybe somebody else, And so if you take them as dogma, and if you take them as a belief, which the mind loves to repurpose things into dogma and belief because it likes its sense of certainty and it likes to feel like it knows, then it becomes a danger. I think particularly with his work, he's a very cerebrally oriented person. And I think, it's one of the reasons why he's so effective, but it's also one of the reasons why, it can be quite a trap to fall into, because it's so thought oriented that it's like almost like the thought, like the mind extra grabs onto it and likes to create its own like framework for things. And so I think to mitigate that effect, I think if you're listening to Leo or anybody else really, just to realize that the mind cannot know this, and to think of the mind as a tool that ultimately can't fathom of reality. So if the mind is like a measuring stick, you're trying to measure the universe with a 12-inch ruler, and it's not gonna work out. There are limitations to the human mind. So anything that comes up as a thought is going to have to be compressed in a very extreme way, like you could compress a computer file. And so just having that kind of realization helps, like soften that effect, I think.
Yeah, and it's like it's so uncomfortable to like let to force the ego to like let go of its control of what it like thinks it should know. Or like when you're pursuing all these teachers, it's uncomfortable, and especially it's kind of like not it's not really like promoted at all in our society to like understand that there's stuff outside of our intellect. I mean, I found that especially like in my high school, it's kind of all focused on objective fact. Let's get the objective fact. Let's look at religion. I'm in a religions course right now. It's like, let's look at religion from the most objective viewpoint and try to understand what they believe and what they understand. But at the same time, entirely missing the mark, in that we don't understand like how much there is to know outside of our intellect, and how much there is that you can experience, or that you can, yeah, basically how much you can experience outside of the intellect.
Yeah, so with like Western culture. Like, there's a lot of this kind of lean toward like almost focusing on the mind at the, as like the superior thing, and then like, a neglect toward the body and other elements like the emotions, and
Yeah.
thinking that if you can boil something down to the most objective thing, that that's going to always be the wisest decision to go with in every instance. Now, sometimes it might be, but other times it might not be. So, like, for example, I was talking to someone the other day, and they were having to face with a difficult decision, where the outcome could potentially hurt another person, but ultimately it would be very understandable if they made that choice because, ultimately they were having to do a lot of waiting and, like there was no guarantee that things would work out. And so, I asked that person, like, okay, if you look from an objective perspective, like what would you say? And he wasn't choosing that. He was choosing, like, so basically from the objective perspective, he said it would be very reasonable for him to go ahead and move on, and like since that other person was understanding, like it would make sense. And if he were thinking about somebody else doing it, it would be quite a normal decision for them to make, and he wouldn't fault them for that decision. But he himself could not make that decision in the situation because he had an awareness of the emotions of the other person as well as his emotions. And so I think normally, from the standpoint of like how society takes things, it's like it's almost would say that like going for the most objective thing would be the most wise in that situation, whereas there's a more complex thing going on there that has to do with human emotions, and that's something that's an element that's often neglected as well. So it's kind of like everything, wanting to boil everything down to this reductionist, intellectual objectivist perspective.
Yeah. And definitely like it's not completely like bad to focus things from an objective point of view. I mean, like science is great and there's like so much value to it, but we don't realize how much value there is to the other side of the story too. And like what just came up was I was just thinking how like yoga is like this practice where you use your body for self-realization. It's like you get tapped deeper into your emotions, into your like movements and everything. And same with like meditation, you're just understanding your emotions or why you react the way you do on a very deep level. But with the Western mindset of this objective point of view, it's kind of just westernized these practices and like, oh, let's just go do yoga and exercise, or let's go do mindfulness meditation so that we can be present, and which is good, but there's so much more than that too. Like,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think like, and for me, this was always like kind of a tension for me because I always look again, I always had this desire to make connections with people, and in a place where I couldn't really feel like I fit in because I've had those experiences, and like my MO was very different from a lot of the other teachers when I was working with them. And so there was always like this kind of wanting to hold back on that aspect, and definitely wanting to seem as rational as possible, like a rationalist, because if somebody were to know that I were into spirituality, it'd almost be like, oh yeah, write that person off, like is there, they're not thinking right, they're, off in the clouds or whatever it happens to be. And so what I found, and this is probably why I found Jungian psychology first, as I had mentioned to you before the podcast started, so I found Jungian psychology, and it was like, okay, so he was a doctor, he's a psychologist, very firmly like respected in Western culture, and yet he dabbled in the mystical. And I feel like this was a good way for me to kind of step into, ultimately what I knew was the right direction, but was afraid to go in because of the social consequences of that, and wanting to be able to be seen in a positive light, in regard to Western society, and in regard to how people typically look upon people that they would consider credible, and as soon as you usually as soon as you start talking about anything beyond, like the rationalist scientific perspective, it's like, they almost would say that it would be number one, an invalidation of the rationalist and scientific perspective, which it's not, but also like it's like, almost like mixing up that which is like not rational to something that is or irrational with something that is just beyond and has transcended rationality, or is a completely different perspective that has its own ways of working and its own sense of validity.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I feel like what I've seen in my life is like from this objectivist point of view, it's hard to like say that you're a spiritual person because everyone has these stereotypes about what spirituality is, and they're just like, oh, he's into this new age woo woo spirituality. Like, they have no clue what they're talking about. But like exactly what you said, they mix up. They don't have this distinction between irrationality and transcendent, like beyond rationality. And so, like, I guess I get just totally. That's definitely a great way of putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I guess what helped me really dabble in that quite a bit, and again, it's always like trying to find like almost like covers for it. Like what I noticed throughout,
Yeah,
it's like my art was a cover for it. And then like, like Jungian psychology, even though I really enjoyed, the art and Jungian psychology, both in a sense, like were like things that were accepted by society as a cover for what I would, really be wanting to do, which is to, explore what's beyond, and like to kind of think in a more holistic way about things. And in a sense, it does have its own culture. In a sense, you could find other people who are into it. But now it's like, now that I have branched out a bit more to kind of bring it back to the earlier topic, it's like now that need for a sense of community with people and a sense of connection with people doesn't have to be met by my most immediate people in my life. I can actually, I don't have to have like my cover for it, like internally, like,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, definitely. Like, that's definitely. I feel like that's a mechanism that goes on because you're trying to go deeper into spirituality, but then at the same time, you're like, all right, how do I explain this to people without them thinking I'm weird and like ostracizing me because I have such these to what they view as radical viewpoints. It's like one thing that I've always been interested in is travel, and like once I started going deeper, I'm like, now I'm having all these thoughts like maybe I should travel to like Asia somewhere to like try to find people that don't see those ideas as radical, and like they see them as normal, and if anything they somewhat view the Western views as kind of not normal. And I feel like the internet is a great way to do that too. Is there's so many people online, you can connect with people by at the push of a button, and you can find people that are also interested in this kind of work and stuff, that where you can discuss and like help each other grow rather than trying to cover up your spiritual interests.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I do think it's great in that sense, like in terms of like the internet being a place where, different people of like mind can like find each other. And, I had one of my clients who described the internet, and I thought it was a really good analogy, as like the central nervous system of humanity, like it kind of
Yeah.
connects everything. And and I guess to the benefit and detriment of people as well, because it's like it can attract like a bunch of like spiritual people together who are interested in that topic, but then it's like, oh, like then there's like serial killers anonymous, it can attract a lot of like negative kind of things too. But in that sense, it's like there is just sense of connection. I can just imagine, if I were a person like living in the 1930s or something like that, I would just be like, okay, I guess I'm just gonna tuck away this part of myself and until
Yeah,
until I die,
exactly. Like with everything, there's always good and bad. Like the internet, it's like an extension of ourselves. at the same time, it can be like a distraction because we're always on the internet. We're always trying to connect with people, and like with the egocentric nature of like the Western society, there's all these everyone's inserting their ego online into like social media, or like they're connecting with people, and some people are building up these, like, I don't know if you want to, cult might be too much of a word, but they're building up like these groups, pockets of online where they're just like self-validating themselves without looking at any other evidence, and like, but at the same time, it's a really powerful tool if you know how to use it right, and you can connect with so many spiritual and people that are on the same path. But I feel like we just talked about that over and over again. But
Oh yeah. Yeah, like there's a lot of like almost in a sense like there's growth and decay and everything. It's kind of like you can't have something that's like all just positive. There's almost like a positive and negative that comes along with every single thing. No, but there was something that I wanted to respond to earlier. I can't remember what it was. It flew out of my mind. Let me
yeah,
think.
that happens way too often when I'm podcasting. I'll just have something to say, and then I'll just stop and be frozen, and they're like, "Are you gonna say something?" I'm like, I just I lost my train of thought. Yeah,
Yeah, no, I get that when I'm doing my life coaching sessions as well. Like, it's like I'll have like a question that'll come up and then like, the conversation will continue. I'm like, I have to ask that question. And then like later I'll be like, oh, what was that question? No.
yeah,
And go blank for a while.
yeah, definitely. All right, well, I think that was a pretty good full-length episode right there. I think we can start wrapping it up.
All right, yep, that sounds good. No, thank you for having me on the show and like I
Yeah,
really
definitely.
appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the coming on the show, and definitely had some deep talks. That was very fun.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, anyway, I'll talk to you later.
All right, definitely. Bye.
All right, bye.